All right, everyone. Well, welcome to the second in the series with Linda Alkire, and she's going to talk about what is the theoretical contribution in business research. And I can't think of anyone better than an editor of one of our top business journals, the Journal of Service Management. And Linda has also published in a number of our top business journals as well. So she knows what it's like from a reviewer's point of view, an author's point of view, an associate editor's point of view, and an editor's point of view. And so we're going to, I think, learn a great deal from Linda's experience. So it'll be about 45 minutes and then questions at the end, or would you rather have questions as we go?
I mean, given that it's, maybe let's keep them to the end, just so I make sure I finish the content. Let's keep them till the end.
Yeah, and so for the people online, I will watch the chat and read your questions out at the end. So you can put your questions in there.
Perfect. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, for the warm introduction. And thank you, everyone, coming back today. 2 days back to back listening to me. I appreciate the time and effort you made to be here today. It's really an honor and pleasure. I've been having a wonderful time here today. We'll be talking about what is a theoretical contribution in business. And like Rebecca mentioned, I'm going to be talking about it from the editor perspective. This is why I have this slide in front of me to give a little bit of background for those of you who might not know what the journal is. And so I'm going to talk about the topic from an editor perspective, from an AE perspective, but also from an author perspective. But first, let's look into a little bit, very briefly, on the journal for those of you who are not familiar. So Professor Kabadai and myself have the honor of serving as co-editors-in-chief as of March of this year. So we agreed to do this work. We were nominated, actually. This wasn't in the plans. We were nominated by the service community. We got more than 80 signatures saying that we trust these two to lead the journal into the new era. So it was it's been really a fun ride doing this together, especially with that we are very good co-authors. We've published together. We were co-chairs of ServSig. So we have a really nice working relationship there that definitely helps. When leading a journal, you want to make sure you get along well with your co-editor to make sure that the journal is on track. And while I'm here, he's holding the fort there. The journal has really done very well over the last years. We currently have a 7.9 impact factor. To give you a little bit of background as well, we're also, our citation metrics, we're 23.3 site score by Scopus. Our 5-year impact factor is 10.1. A little bit about the timeline. We tend to stay as efficient as possible. It's getting harder by the minute. Every day we receive between 15 to 20 submissions every single day. So you can imagine how hard that sometimes can get. You can't be away from the system for more than 2 days. Otherwise, it's just overwhelming. And that's why it needs 2 people to run the show. We tend to do the first review as editors within the 26-day period, the desk review at that point. Once you get the acceptance letter, we try to have it online, early site, within 30 days. And then our acceptance rate, you can see it here, 7.5. So we have a pretty high rejection rate. Does that mean?
Can someone mute the microphone?
But that's what I hope. I hope that
you can see some
anyone
listening.
The characterizing does withdraw.
Not so much listening.
You withdraw from it for whatever reason.
We're talking.
I'm muting off.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. So we have an acceptance rate of 7.5, which is as of mid-year, which I assume it might be even lower given the amount of papers we're getting. So a little bit about what is JOSM is about. This is a new positioning. It's not a new positioning, but we wanted to clarify the positioning of the journal with regards to the other service journals that are out there. So historically, the journal has been known the Journal of Service Management. So we wanted to go back to the roots with a specific focus on this idea of the management of a service. So as a journal, we want to be an interdisciplinary, but also a managerially relevant journal dedicated to advancing the knowledge of effective management of service. So we're looking at the management side of things, the company, the organization side of things, as opposed to more of the customer and consumer side of things. Not to say that we don't accept customer and consumer type of papers, but they need to to have some sort of a managerial implications for organizations. So we do emphasize rigorous, I'm going to talk a little bit about rigor, theory-informed research that enhance understanding of how services are strategically designed. So it's about the design of the service, how strategically they're delivered, how strategically they're governed, and how could we improve them as well. And we really want to focus on this real world application. And this is why when we receive papers, we really look into making sure that whatever insight we are getting from the paper, it should result in some actionable service insight. So we're not so much interested in theory focused paper, more so in more application actionable insight types of paper. Having said that, of course, this is the general positioning, and we welcome service papers that are integrating interdisciplinary work, for instance, papers from management, from marketing, operation, HR, as long as they're addressing this idea of the management of service. And we do really make sure that we check the strong managerial relevance. So if the paper has incremental or is just mentioning managerial relevance, but just because you have to have that piece in the structure of the paper, if that is something that is trivial, not very well defended, not very well thought through, that's probably not a good fit for the journal. And someone during my meetings with them asked me, like, what's the number one reason for rejection for JOSM recently? It has been the lack of fit. So we really are keen on making sure that there is a good fit with the positioning of the journal. And honestly, 90% of what we get that gets desk rejected is possibly because it is a bad fit. They're sending us a paper just because it is done in a service setting, hospitality. There you go. It's not contributing to service research, or it's done in an educational setting. Just because it is a new setting doesn't mean it is contributing to service research. So just wanted to set that up. Some of the areas that we are interested in as a journal, these are like the key areas of interest for us: service strategy and excellence, service experience, service ecosystems and value co-creation. Yes.
If we're talking about education, would management of education then be like the administration of the university? Would that then count for management of education contexts?
It could be as to how can we design the educational system, for example, or how. But in this instance, it still has to have an implication beyond the educational setting.
Sure.
So just because it's done in education is probably not sufficient for us. But it could be as a case, as long as the findings are transferable and applicable to other areas as well. Technology and service. Again, technology is disrupting how services are being managed, so there's a big emphasis on that. Service productivity, service innovation and design, how to design services, how to innovate services, employee engagement and service culture. So for those of you who are doing frontline work, that would be sitting over here. Service operation, servitization, B2B services as well, and sustainability, transformative and ethical service from an organizational perspective. So having said that, I kind of wanted to give you that background because my talk is built on that experience as well. And I'm going to giving some examples from JOSM as we are going through this talk. So one of the things that you possibly could think about now that I've mentioned the background of the journal and what do we think about theory, I really want to go back to this interesting quote by Kurt Loewen, written back in 1934. And for those of you who don't know, he's considered one of the founders of the social psychology field. And what he says here is very interesting and very applicable to the journal and business research in general. Nothing is quite so practical as a good theory. We don't tend to think about theory as a practical thing, right? And I think this is kind of sets the tone to a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about here today. So let's start with one of the latest definitions of theory. Obviously, there's 100 definitions of theory. This is one of the simplest and the ones that I kind of personally kind of associate with. Theories have the potential to explain a phenomena ahead of mere description, right? So in this case, theory tried to answer the question of why and how, and not just what. And again, I had a talk with some of you here during my stay, and sometimes we're looking at the question or we're looking at a specific topic or a research topic with this idea of answering the what question. What happens when we do this and this? What happens when we introduce this technology? What happens when this new design is implemented? And unfortunately, this is considered very, very incremental type of contribution. What really is of interest is try to answer the why. behind the question. Why did this happen when we introduced this new technology? Why did this happen when we changed the design of the service? How did this impact the well-being of the employees, or how did that impact the strategy that was implemented? I'm just trying to think of various examples. So moving away from this what question to really dig deeper into the mechanisms behind it by answering the why and the how. And robust theory connects scholarship to practice and to policy. So practice could be beyond managerial, again, by revealing mechanisms. So the mechanisms is what is basically we answer by the question of why and how. Now we're looking at what is a theoretical contribution. And again, this is one of the latest definition, 2025. I thought this was really interesting the way they phrased it here. And by the way, I have the whole list of references at the end, which you can all, I highly recommend reading all those papers that I reference here. Again, I wanted to bring in the latest literature because most of us have had that training, but I wanted to kind of bring in some of the latest work in this field. And the way they define theoretical contribution is the articulation of new theoretical knowledge. The knowledge, the change between what we knew before and what we know afterwards. I think there has been some changes because of the font, the Mac, and so I do apologize about that. So what we knew before and what we know afterwards because of the theory. So in an ideal world, a paper contributes theoretically when it is adding new conceptual insights and clarity. It's explaining something we didn't know before. It's extending, integrating, or is challenging. And again, we talked to some people about, let's challenge some of the assumptions that we know as an idea of not making that theoretical contribution, and also offering explanation that travel beyond one setting, kind of back to your question, right? So it has to move beyond the just, well, it applies in education, or it applies in hospitality, or it applies in Zambia, or it applies only in Australia, right? So we need to take it beyond that one specific setting. That's when it's a real theoretical contribution. And I wanted to refer this specific paper published in the Academy of Management Review, where they did this 2x2 approach. And I thought that was such an interesting, although I'm not a big fan usually of 2x2s, but this one is really very interesting. They put two dimensions of what is a theoretical contribution and what kind of categories within a theoretical contribution you can have. So you have the originality factor. And the originality could be revelatory, which they define as offer novel, surprising, or counterintuitive insights that is changing the way we understand a specific phenomena, versus originality is very incremental. It's not groundbreaking, in other words. So in this case, it adds something to the existing theory, but without massive refinement or by refining it or extending it. On the other hand, they're looking at the utility of theory, of the theoretical contribution. Is it contributing to practice, or is it actually scientifically useful? So is it practically useful or scientifically useful? Obviously, when we talk scientifically useful, it improves conceptual and empirical testability. When it's practically useful, it's offering some practical insights for practitioners, whether it's managers, society, public policy, etc. Now, it becomes really interesting when you look at these quadrants. Because what they say through the method they did, they took the most cited papers published in the Academy of Management Review over the 20 years, and they tried to place them among these different quadrants. This is how they came up with it, the method behind it. So what they're saying, if the research is falling in the Q1 category, it's a revelatory, originality, and scientifically useful, this is the ideal contribution. This is like perfect, right? You have something new, it's changing the way we're doing things, but it's also original, it's new. It's not something that had been done and rehashed many, many times. If the paper is falling in the Q2, it's very scientifically useful, but the originality not so much. Usually it's when you're extending theories that have been there, you're testing them in different areas. So often accepted, but seen as a safe space. Also, I talked with some of you about having a perfect paper, right? That could be a perfect paper. It's done properly. The rigor is there. Everything's there, but it's not ground shaking, in other words. Then they have the Q3 here, where you have the originality and incremental, and it is useful practically. So they call it here rejection with scorn. The contribution is very weak. And then finally, in the Q4, you have practicality is useful, and the originality is revelatory. They call it rejection with praise. It's a great paper, but, right? We love what you did, but that's exactly where it sits in here. So appreciated for relevance, but often not so much by the academic reviewer, especially in top-ranked journals. So I really like this approach because they really actually explain the theoretical contribution, placing it along these things. But most importantly, what they did beyond just this categorization, they included two things to think about as we move forward. One, think about the scope, right? So they're saying in an ideal world, you want a paper that's doing both. You want a paper that combines the scientific and the practical utility together, kind of going back to my earlier comment, but also, and again, I talked to some of you about this idea of pre-science. Not testing something that has been done or something that has been going on, but thinking about what is it going to be like in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years? What are some of the things that we want to be thinking about moving forward, not just because where it's happening right now? And in the paper, they talk about how engineers, they're engineering technology that we're going to use in 10, 15 years. Why we in the business school are researching stuff that it's being happening right now or that has happened already in industry. And just by the way, because no one wrote a paper about it, we need to write a paper about it. So this idea of pre-science was really cool. And someone asked me, like, how can we decide which paper is going to an A+ journal versus a B journal, right? We talked about that earlier. And in my opinion, it's this. You're not only explaining what's happening right now, but you're also anticipating future trends, future directions. You're not just like, well, this is what's happening right now, let's explore it. You're already thinking ahead. Think again, think about the engineers and the scientists, the real scientists that are inventing stuff. They're inventing stuff that will be used 10, 15, 20 years from now. They're not inventing stuff that already are around us, right? So this pre-science thought is very important. Another article that I thought is really interesting is this idea of the 8 components where you can actually make a contribution. So when we think of theoretical contribution, a lot of times we think about, well, I need to come up with a new theory. But theoretical contribution can happen through many ways and different ways within an article. And this one was published on the Strategic Management Review. And the way they think about the 8 components where we can actually contribute, it could be in the research question, a novel research question, like what problem or question does this theory address? This is usually the most common that we think about. I need the theoretical contribution in the question. However, there are 7 other ways where we can do a theoretical contribution. For example, yes.
Are you going to share your slides afterwards?
Oh, absolutely.
Perfect. I recognize I'm taking photographs every single slide. I'm like, so I can just put my phone down and.
Absolutely, absolutely. Happy to do that. Absolutely. The second area where we can actually have a contribution is this mode of theorizing. How is theory developed and reasoned? And again, in the paper, they give this specific, they call it a taxonomy of ways to make a theoretical contribution. And to answer the what question, the how question, excuse me, they have included mode of theorizing, right? Like, are you shifting from static mode to dynamic mode, shift between formal, informal, shift between analytical, numerical? They give a couple of examples of how the mode of theorizing you can make a contribution in. The other one, which is also very common, it's the who, right? In the service literature, we moved from theorizing at the consumer level to the meso level to the macro level. And that kind of brought in that whole literature about service ecosystems. We changed in the who. We used to study the individual, the dyadic relationship. We moved to studying more of the ecosystem literature. That's this level of analysis we're contributing to. Another very important one, the why. Right? We talked about it earlier, the why. Why does this happen? Why is this interesting? Why is that not interesting? Right? Counterintuitive questions that explain the why behind, they call it causal mechanism. Why does this phenomenon occur? Not only what phenomena occur. Construct and variables, and that's where you're looking at the key elements of the theory. So again, they give examples here about redefine, clarify, broaden a specific construct or a specific variable, change a construct role, whether it was an antecedent, whether it is an outcome, a mediator, a moderator. We see a lot of that in the modeling type of papers where we are testing moderators and mediators. in the boundary conditions. That's another important one. Like this theory doesn't work in this setting because of these boundary conditions. So you're coming up with new boundaries that might question the original theoretical contribution. Like under what condition does the theory hold, or under what condition does the theory does not hold, right? And then the outputs, right? We see a lot of papers as well trying to argue that the output is different if you do this and this and that. So as you can see, we can frame, and I wanted to include this to help us think about how can we frame the theoretical contribution. The theoretical contribution could be framed along these different categories. It's in the question and the theory, and I'll talk a little bit more later on, but one thing I want to highlight now, while a paper could have one or two areas you're doing a theoretical contribution, it cannot have them all. If it's trying to answer all of these, it's probably doing nothing, right? So being strategic as to how we phrase our theoretical contribution and where exactly are we theorizing according to this how, who, where, why, and etc., will make a big difference in how you position the paper, how you position the theoretical contribution. This was also extremely interesting to me. This was published in the Academy of Management 2025, and they created this comparison, which is super cool. What a theoretical contribution is not versus how to get to a theoretical contribution. So one of the things they talk about is a theoretical contribution beyond fascinating settings. We get a lot of those as journal editors. Service quality hasn't been studied in Jamaica. Jamaica is a very interesting country. Let's do the service quality scale in Jamaica. Just because no one has done it in Jamaica doesn't mean it is a theoretical contribution. Beyond patterns and regularity. So what do they say? Hey, make sure research question is driven by the theoretical puzzle, developed constructs that are applicable beyond the specific context. So even though your case study, your data collection could be in a specific setting, what's interesting to a journal editor is how does that apply in other settings, not just in that specific setting.
Start to look at identification in that context? Because you talked about causal, the why.
Right.
Right. If people talk to me about Jamaica,
Yes.
I usually ask them what's different about Jamaica from the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
And how do you get that to identify a causal effect?
Absolutely.
You have something in Jamaica that you don't have in the US.
Yes.
Is that the discussion, or?
I mean, it depends how this is phrased. I mean, even personally, we've published the papers that have been like the data is collected in Colombia, and Colombia is a unique setting, and Latin America hasn't been studied. But then the way we position that is saying that it is a unique setting in a developing country. This is something that is unique to that area, but it's also applicable in other area, or it is characteristic. Exactly. It applies here.
We talk about that afterwards. You don't do identification yet. That's what I hear. But let's talk about that afterwards.
Okay.
That's something that you can take. I keep talking to colleagues in business. I read papers about 15 years ago in economics. This was a big discussion there. Well, let's talk about it afterwards.
Yes, I'm curious. I'd like to know more. Beyond pattern and regularities, right? Not just empirical patterns without explanation. Just because there is a pattern in there, that if you're not able to explain that pattern, that most likely is not a good theoretical contribution. So you want to make sure we move from describing pattern to explaining the mechanism, going back to this why or how question, right? Answer the why question that I just mentioned. Beyond opening black boxes, well, hey, this is a new setting. I've done this extensive qualitative research, but all I did is I showed you there is a black box, right? But I'm not opening that black box. What's really interesting is opening that black box, not just mapping sequences. Well, this relates to this, or this happens because of that. Explore fundamental tension that drive organizational dynamic, considering combining process and variance perspectives in this case. So we want to try to understand the tensions that are happening that explain a specific phenomenon. Beyond boxes and arrows, again, we see a lot of those, again, especially in quant's paper, where we get a lot of models with little to no explanation of how they came up with these relationships, with little to no explanation how do these constructs relate to each other. And the idea here, move beyond showing what happens to explaining why it happens, kind of repeating the same thing, right? Focus on the why. Beyond hyperboles, not just excessive claims, which again happens a lot, especially in qualitative research, substantiate claims by building fair, comprehensive arguments, right? Craft theoretical and empirical storylines to explain the finding that you found in your qualitative data. And beyond emulating past work, that is another big point where we're not just recopying or applying new theories to new contexts. What's the saying? Like old wine in a new bottle, right? That's exactly what that means. We don't want the new wine, the old wine in a new bottle just because it's a new setting, it's a new a new area. Like we get a lot of those papers. Well, we've done this the technology acceptance model with the self-service technology. Now let's do the technology acceptance model with robots, or let's do the technology acceptance model with AI. Same thing, it's just the technology is changing. So you're not doing it. Really theoretical contribution. Leverage beyond the moment, right? Leverage the moment, adapt and extend or innovate prior theory to contemporary contexts, balance AI with the human interpretation. And again, I do have a couple of papers. Those of you who are doing AI research, I shared some with Ryan yesterday of how to use that AI at different levels of writing a paper. I think we talked about those papers too, Rebecca. I'll share that with you too at the end. Now, having given you some of the highlights, some of the papers that I thought would be really relevant for this conversation, I kind of sat down and started to think about, from my own perspective, how would I put these things together to try to showcase how we evaluate theoretical contribution or editors in general. And after a lot of thinking and moving things around back and forth, I kind of came up with these 4 categories with the rigor serving as the base for them. So we're going to talk about how to position your paper, how to make sure we have a coherent story in your theoretical contribution, the relevance of your theoretical contribution, and the communicability of the theoretical contribution. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about rigor because, in my opinion, rigor is the gold standard. None of this matters if this is not there. And I'm going to talk about what does rigor mean to me, right? It serves as the essential foundation upon which all of this holds. But let's start with the first one, positioning. Positioning is basically answering the basic question of which conversation are you trying to contribute to or are you extending, right? The purpose of this specific area, we're looking at clear theoretical positioning, where your work fits and how it contributes to an ongoing scholarly conversation. So the positioning that you're using for your work. And then having talked with Rebecca, she mentioned it would be really cool to include some of the red flags or what is an indication that this most likely is going to get rejected. Whether that's rejected or rejected by the reviewers varies, but most likely going to get rejected because of these reasons. And then I'm going to talk about what to do instead. Okay, so there's a structure. One of the main things about positioning is your introduction, right? And the introduction does not clearly specify which theoretical conversation the paper contributes to. So in a lot of instances, the introduction is serving as setting the tone, but it does not say what is the theoretical contribution of your specific paper. And it is a big flag because what you want to do, you want to make it as clear and as straightforward and as obvious as possible to the reviewer and to the editor that your theoretical contribution is clear in your introduction. The literature gap is generic. For example, few studies have examined. We see that all the time. Just because few studies have examined doesn't mean this is worthwhile examining. Maybe that's why it's not worthwhile examining. Right? So moving away from that mindset of the literature review is very generic to more of existing theory fails to explain, again, the why and the how of X, Y, and Z. Much better positioning than this. Sometimes it's a choice of words. I'll talk about that in the communicability. But the idea is just because something hasn't been studied, that doesn't mean it's worth studying. And even if it does, it hasn't been studied before and it is worth studying, explain what is it exactly that you're studying, the why of something, the how of something. The research question is very descriptive. And that happens a lot in those projects that are mainly coming from practice, which is nothing wrong in that, but it has to still have some theory behind it. We can't just have an interesting setting, and that's why I'm writing this paper. It has to be theory driven from the get-go, even if the question is coming from industry. That's what I said earlier. The paper cannot do everything, right? So if I'm trying to answer all these different streams and I'm trying to contribute to 5 different areas, I'm probably not contributing to any. And we get sometimes those papers where I'm pretty sure, Rebecca, you've seen a lot of those where like you're trying to do 10 contributions in one paper. And it just doesn't make much sense because you can tell right there, right then, that this is probably not contributing to anything if you're contributing to 10 different areas. For me personally, and for JOSM, the so what question is so important as well. We have this amazing setting, the question is coming from industry, there is a theory, but so what? What did I learn? What does that mean? For JOSM specifically, it has to have a so what question for management, for managerial implications for the organization. The introduction lists prior work without synthesizing or problematizing it. That is another thing you see, especially we see that either in the introduction or in the literature review, where like X did this, Y did that, then C added this comment, and then it reads like a collection of sentences with no actual synthesis that is leading to what you're going to do in the methodology and moving forward. Yes.
Could you just explain the difference for people between gap spotting?
Yes.
And problematizing?
Oh, absolutely. So gap spotting, you're looking at what hasn't been studied before, kind of like the same idea of like, this hasn't been done before. By itself is not sufficient, just like I mentioned, right? By itself, it's not sufficient. Just because there is a gap, it doesn't mean it is worth answering. Right. The so what question, right? Problematizing is when you're creating that dialogue. I cannot not think of a better way of explaining it, but like you're thinking of that dialogue between the different literatures that have addressed this, and you're synthesizing it in a way that is leading to what you actually did. Do you have a better way of explaining it?
No, but if anyone's interested in the types of problematizing, Jorgen Sandberg from UQ is probably the lead author in this. The Sandberg and Alverson article that says, I think there's like 6 different ways you can problematize, and it's really good if you can then say that's the approach you take and be explicit.
Are you saying you problematize the gap? So you actually
The literature.
missing, or you say there is conflict in the literature and
Yes.
I'm potentially providing a theoretical way to realign, explain, contrast.
Yes.
And some reviewers just want to vomit when they see the word gap spotting.
Yes.
So nobody ever objects to problematizing, but you can get a reviewer who absolutely hates gap spotting.
Yes.
So I'm now doing more problematizing because that appeals to both camps.
I've actually worked with co-authors that would not want to use the word gap anywhere in the paper.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've had pushback from problematizing from more conservative journals, definitely. They prefer the rephrasing of building on existing theories.
Yes.
I don't
I've
like
had that
problematizing.
too. I've got that too, where they consider that too extreme of a position. They want you to bring people together as opposed to set them apart. So I've had that comment too. Like, I'm not contrasting, I'm trying to find the middle ground.
If anyone wants to discuss problematizing, I actually do a workshop on it in reading and critiquing literature.
That's
I'm
great.
happy to have
Maybe we can do that as a seminar.
Oh, yeah, it's a great one. Another big red flag, especially in the positioning, you claim novelty without showing how it advances understanding, right? And kind of builds up on the idea of like, well, no one has done it. That's why I'm the first one to do that. And then the title and abstract signal empirical focus only, no keywords, no theory, very descriptive in what is it that you're doing. So let's look now at what could be done in this case. So some of the recommendation, at least from our journal, define which theory or stream of your literature you're speaking to in the first page. It has to be pretty clear. It has to be also mentioned in the abstract. What is the theory you're talking about? What are the main constructs you're studying? It can't be buried in page number 3 while you're setting up whatever is happening. Clarify the gap you are addressing. What remains missing, outdated, unexplained, inconsistent. Just saying there's a gap is not enough, right? What is it that you're saying? What is missing? This hasn't been done. This is missing. Outdated, maybe unexplained. And again, I couldn't think of different areas, but this kind of where sets your paper apart from whatever is there. See how your study adds new insight, not by listing citations, going back to just literature review, but by explaining how your argument moves the conversation forward, right? And this is kind of back to the point of, great, this is what has been happening, and this is how I'm going to move this conversation forward. Make the so what obvious. The so what should be obvious, again, hopefully by page number 2 of your article, not somewhere in page number 15. Because you already lost the reader by page number 2 if this hasn't been mentioned, or at least coming across. Few tips here, scan early paragraph, that's what we do. We're all super busy, and I can tell you for a fact that reviewers are very lazy readers. Okay, they're very lazy readers. You might be spending hours formulating one sentence. They might not even read it, because they're scanning through it, right? So make very clear your first paragraph that it is, where is it positioning, and the positioning is super clear. This is the question that needs to be answered. Why does this paper matter? This theoretical audience. In other words, the so what, right? And if the paper could fit into 10 conversations, it's probably not fit anywhere. If you're trying to address the technology and the setting and the management behind it and the customers and how that impacts X, Y, and Z, it's probably not doing any of that. The next component that I wanted to talk about is coherence. Are the construct logically connected of whatever you're studying? Is there a logical connection between the different components? So coherence reflects what we call internal consistency. Whether it's in your arguments, whether it's in your construct, whether it's in your method. Does the method answer the question? That's a question of coherence. We see that a lot, where you have a great problem to solve, but the method is wrong. There's no coherence between the method that you chose versus the question that you're answering. There should be a coherence there, right? So some of the red flags, again, poorly defined, inconsistently used, or overlapped conceptually. There's no clarification between these constructs. That's another big one we see a lot. The causal logic is not there. A causes B because of A. Circular thinking, right? Not getting anywhere. The paper lacks a clear theoretical mechanism linking antecedents and outcome. There's no logical explanation of how you set up whatever is an antecedent versus whatever is an outcome, and it's not clearly defined in what you're trying to do. That's another big one. It reads like a laundry list. We just put in all these concepts, and whatever worked, we put it in the model. Whatever didn't work, we didn't include it, right? There needs to be a theoretical reasoning for the way these variables are being put together in a framework. Hypotheses or propositions, if that's what you're going for, are not logically derived from prior arguments, and that is a big problem as well, especially in the hypothesis development section, where the literature that is being reviewed or the arguments that are being made are not directly linked to whatever you're hypothesizing. There's a mismatch between theory and method, and we see that a lot. Kind of talked a little bit about it. The boundary condition, whether it is the when and where the theory applied, are ignored. And I think this is one of the, just like we said earlier, this is one of the areas where you could possibly have a theoretical contribution. And the argument includes contradictory assumptions drawn from incompatible theories. That happens, again, a lot, because we see that we're having, people are just trying to explain something, forcing the theory in there, while there is no logical connection between the constructs. So what to do instead? Check that all constructs are well-defined and used consistently throughout. And again, if you're using several constructs, make sure that constructs are well-defined. We see that a lot as well, where you're creating the argument, but you're not defining or explaining your construct till you're halfway through the literature review. You already lost the author by that, the reader by that time. Ensure causal relationship make conceptual sense. So it is pretty clear which one is the antecedent, which one is the mediator, which one is the outcome, which one is the moderator. And then the most important part is that the story must stand together, right? It should be building step by step on the next stage, and it shouldn't be reading as separate parts of the framework. So the question to be answered is, are the construct meaningfully linked? Is there a logical explanation? And does the reasoning flow across the framework? So logical inconsistencies or fuzzy constructs are a major reason for rejection, even in otherwise interesting study. So if the constructs are not very clear, if they're not very well connected, that is going to create a lot of problems. So the reviewers are going to start questioning everything. If they start questioning the connection between your two main constructs, they're going to question everything else too. Relevance, right? And that's a big one as well. We saw earlier the originality and the practicality 2x2 framework. It kind of builds a little bit on that. A contribution value on who it benefits, whether it's you're benefiting scholars, so it's your contribution is for research, your contribution is only a theoretical, conceptual type of work falls in here. Is it trying to benefit managers? This is the type of contributions we're specifically looking for in JOSM. Or society, right? If you're doing type of TSR work, social marketing work, is that the contribution you're making? And some of the red flags here as well, the reasons for rejection, the paper addressed a trivial or overly narrow issue. And we see that a lot as well, where the focus is so narrow that it won't apply to any specific other context. And the relevance is mainly relevant to that specific company. It's not relevant to anybody else or that specific setting. The findings are replicating what we already know without extending our knowledge. It does not generalize beyond one context or data set. It only works in that context. It only works for that company. It only works for that specific data set. And that's another one we see a lot where managerial or societal implication are an afterthought. We wrote this paper and we need to find out some relevance. Yeah, try to think really hard, get creative there. And then we're going to write, managers should take care of the employees. Big contribution. Managers should be, I don't know, salaries should be paid on time. Great, right? Sometimes it feels forced and it's not appropriate. The authors fails to indicate who benefit. That's another part of the story. So sometimes this whole problem is not there because the whole section on relevance is not existent. And strong practical recommendation, but no theoretical advancement. And that's kind of like the other side of things, right? It's very practical, but the theory is lacking. That is another kind of side of the story. So, theoretical relevance, you want to make sure, does your work advance, define, challenge, establish theory? From a practical side of things, can it inform decision-making? Can it help managers do their job better? Can it inform policy and how we can define the policy and the management action moving forward? And we want to make sure that the implications are flowing naturally from theory. In other words, we are not forcing them. Right? We're not forcing the implication. Here's, I really like this specific tip. Would other care if this paper didn't exist? If no one cares, then most likely the journal editor is not going to publish it. Because again, I was talking to some of you earlier, while in the business of being a journal editor, you're not just worried about publishing and keeping the journal going and moving the field forward, and that's all very noble causes. But you also care about the ranking. You also care about the impact factor. You also care about where does the journal stand in the conversation. And if we're trying to publish papers, we want to make sure that these papers are read and that these papers are cited. And if no one cares if this paper didn't exist, beside the authors, that's probably not a good fit for the journal because it's not going to get cited. It's not going to get read. Communicability, and I like to mention that this is very, very important. If authors are not able to communicate the theoretical contribution, even if it's there, That's probably not a good thing. Like you want to make sure that you're making it as clear and possible. Oh, 5 minutes. Okay, hurry. You want to make sure that that people can actually see the contribution find the contribution. And that's why it should be mentioned in the introduction. It should be leading the whole conversation and repeated at the end so that it's as clear as the day as to what the contribution is. It shouldn't be buried. Read the paper and you're like, what are they trying to do? If reviewers and editors cannot summarize the paper in one sentence, that's probably not a good contribution. It's probably not very well communicated. Like if I read the whole paper and if you ask me summarize it in one sentence and I don't know what's it about, you probably weren't clear in your contribution. You want to avoid jargon, please, as an editor, I can actually please ask you to be very specific about the keywords used, especially with acronyms. We get papers where 15 acronyms and you have to go back every time and look it up. So be careful about how you communicate jargon, acronyms, whatever it is, because it is very confusing for authors. Your figure and tables need to be clear. Double check the format after you've uploaded the thing because sometimes it moves. This is another big no-no. You started the paper with one voice, and then your co-author decided to write the second part, and then suddenly the contribution is totally different than what you said at the front end. You see that all the time, right? You started with one contribution, ended with another contribution. There has been a shift there somewhere in the middle. Redundancy and verbosity, again, if it can be said, I'm like on a mission of, especially with my PhD students, and I work with a lot of them with a French background. And in French, you write in paragraphs, you don't write in like short sentences. So they tend to write like paragraph. But if you can summarize it in one sentence, keep it simple. I actually tell them a sentence more than 10 letters, you're gonna have to rewrite it, 10 words. Rewrite it, simplify. I went through this through my training as well, because I went to a French school. So it took a lot of work to try to kind of simplify the writing, but very important. And obviously, again, please, this just shows that the author didn't pay attention. If there are typos, if you don't follow the journal format, this is kind of a basic advice, but we see it all the time. And especially for JOSM, we see it when people get rejected in JSR, they send it straight to JOSM without changing the format. We get all the rejects from JSR, by the way. We're probably the first journal they send it to, and then it goes down the rank there. But at least change the formatting, so it's not so obvious that it's a JSR reject. Use visual to summarize, make introduction, conclusion, signpost, so that it's pretty clear what the contribution is. Avoid jargon, I said that. And then this is the tip, right? If you can summarize the paper in one paragraph to a colleague, to a friend, to a family member, that is probably a clear contribution. If you can't summarize it in one sentence, it's probably not a good fit. And then the rigor, I wanted to talk a little bit about rigor. As I mentioned, all these 4 categories, they have to be standing on clear ground. And when we talk about rigor, there's 2 ways to look at rigor. If it's an empirical paper, obviously we're talking about the method, and the methodology has to be standing on good ground. If we're talking about conceptual rigor, it has to be, the constructs have to be clear, it should be well communicated, it shouldn't be ambiguous. You're not using outdated citations, you're kind of up to speed to what's going on in the literature. That's why, even when I started this talk, I wanted to include the latest papers that are talking about this. And hopefully we're doing the same when we're writing our papers. We're not starting with the first citation in our article, 1985. Right? It has to be hopefully within the last 2-3 years. So you're showing, already signaling that you're contributing to the latest literature, not something that has been done in the past. Empirical rigor, right? The theory and the method, there's a big disconnect. So sometimes we see papers addressing a specific topic, and then the question seems to be like the best fit to answer that question is an experiment. And for some reason, they went on and did a survey or did a qualitative study. It's not answering the question. Measurement validity and reliability, obviously we need to report. Someone asked me earlier about how do you do that with the limited amount of words, and sometimes the reviewers are asking to all these details. And JOSM, we're highly encouraging people to submit a web appendix that includes as much details about your methodology as you need to include, just so you make sure you're showing that to the reviewer when the paper is going out, they can see the background of what you've done. Maybe not all of that is going to end up going, but it's better to include it. And then they can see, well, this table should be in the main manuscript or what have you. And then showing the process of how you moved from your quotes to not just saying, well, we reached theoretical saturation, right? And we see that all the time, but show how you moved from your quotes to your codes, etc. Selective interpretation is also another big issue where just gonna explain the hypotheses that worked or include the ones that just worked, gonna ignore the others. Lack of transparency, and that's why I said, yes, we're having very limited amount of words in the article. Web appendixes are your way to go here. But also your answer to the reviewer's comment is another great place because you don't have a limit for your response to the reviewers. So include as many details as you can in there as well if you're limited on the article side. So a few things here, kind of I'm going to be very clear about, we talked a little bit about that, but the editorial tip, would this claim still hold if I examine its assumptions? That's the question. If the definitions are vague, circular logic, or the evidence is, people are going to look at that. And if they're not convinced about the rigor of your paper, no matter what you did, even if you have the latest literature review, if you have the best written paper manuscript, if the rigor is not there, that's kind of out. So this is basically the model, right? Talked about positioning, coherence, relevance, and communicability. All of that needs to be standing on rigorous feet. So to summarize, what is a strong theoretical contribution versus a weak one? A strong contribution is answering the why and how as opposed to the what of a question. It extends, refine, and integrate theory to create a new understanding as opposed to apply existing theory to a new setting or new insight without offering new insight. It's offering something new, something surprising, something that challenges our current assumptions, something we didn't know, versus reinforces something we already know. Matters to both scholars and practitioners, especially for our journal. It connects theory with real-world significance versus limited to a narrow, very context-specific, with little broader relevance in general. Present clear, consistent, and logically connected argument versus contain disconnected reasoning, and we talked a little bit about that. Clearly articulated, so the communicability is pretty good. It's not difficult to follow. It's not difficult to read. The storyline flows. Provide solid foundation for further research, for further application, rather than being very lack of conceptual depth or not even having any future implication moving forward. This is the reference list of the various stuff that I used in this article. Highly encourage you to definitely check out some of these papers. Try to include, as I said, the latest work in this field from some of the leading journals in the area. Really exciting stuff going on within the management marketing literatures as well. And thank you.